Welcome to Symfony Workshop. I'm Gary Clarke, and this is part 7 of my Symfony security and authentication series. In this one, we're going to look at permissions. So we've looked at role-based access control. In this one, we're going to look at things which permit a user to perform certain actions on certain subjects. And the example we're going to use is that of an account. Before we get into that, let me just inform you that I record in high resolution, so no need to watch on a blurry screen. Choose high definition if that works for you. And would you like to join a growing group of PHP developers and take your skills to a new level? If that sounds like you, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon, and welcome. Let's start off by creating an account entity, and this is going to be our subject. So we're going to try and perform actions such as show, delete, and depending on who we are, we may or may not be allowed to perform those actions. So Symfony console make :entity account, and that opens up the maker prompts. So we're going to add a field called balance. That will be of type float. It will be not nullable. Then we'll add another property, and we're going to call this account holder, and this will have a many-to-one relationship with the user entity. So the class it relates to is user. The account holder property cannot be nullable because the account needs to have an account holder. Do you want to add a new property to user so that you can access account? I'll put no for that. I won't need that. Okay, let's add another property, and this is going to be account manager. And so this will have a one-to-one relationship with the user. So one account manager to one account. That relates to user, account manager, can't be null, and I don't want to add anything to the user entity. And so that will do us. We are good. Let's go and take a look at our account entity. Hopefully there won't be any surprises in there. So here's our properties and here's the relationship. So that means many accounts to one user. If you need any help with doctrine relations and entities, then check out my doctrine relations series where I explain all that stuff, all the different kind of one-to-one, many-to-one, etc. I'll put a link at the top of the screen for that for you. Our entity looks good, so let's make our migration, which I can do with Symfony console make :migration. It's telling me that the migration has been made, so let's go and check that out, which is in the migrations folder, and here we go. So I'll clean this one up a little bit to make it easier for us to read, and as you can see, 4 properties: ID, account holder ID, account manager ID, and balance. So you notice it's using integer IDs to relate to our user entity table. Let's migrate it with Symfony console doctrine :migrations migrate. And then over to the database. So here's our migrated table. In order to demonstrate what I want to demonstrate, I'm just going to create an extra user in the database who will act as an account manager for the account record that I'm going to create. So just make up any email address, password, then register. And so we've created our new user. Let's go and have a look. So in the database now we have 3 users. 1 who has the role admin, and 2 which don't have any roles, but 1 will act as the account holder and 1 will act as the account manager. So that's our role admin. This second one, which is ID 10, will act as the account holder, and ID 11 will act as the account manager. So let's go and create that account. We'll give it an ID of 1. The account holder is going to be ID 10. The account manager ID will be 11, and we'll just put in a nominal balance of 1,000. Save that. That record has now been created. Now what I want to do is create a method where I can show the account, and then you'll be able to view the account if you have certain permissions. If you recall, we protected the whole controller with this bookmaker is granted annotation. I'm just going to move that onto the index method, and so that's not going to block us, and then we'll create our show method. And so basically, if you're the account holder or if you're the account manager, you'll be able to see this account, but if you're neither of those people, then you won't be able to. So I'll dump out the account, and then I'll add some routing. And for this, I'm going to use param binding. So the ID portion of this URL will map to the ID of the account which is being injected into the show method, and I do that using curly braces. I'll make sure that the only method which can be used on this endpoint is a get. So I have a methods argument which takes an array, and inside there I put in the allowed methods. And then just to be clear on the param binding, the ID which you see here will map to the account which is getting passed in to the method. There are no restrictions set up just yet, so we should be able to visit this and see our account dumped out in the browser, and sure enough we do. So here's our entity, account entity. As you can see, we've got all the account manager details because that is the actual logged in user. The account holder, it just has like a placeholder proxy. It's a doctrine thing, and it's used for lazy loading, and the only property on that, as you can see, is the ID. Now let me try and explain how permissions works in Symfony. I'll give this my best shot. So we check if something is granted an attribute. That can be a role, a permission, or a authentication check such as is authenticated fully. And then the way this works is that the attribute is tested by a voter or something called a voter, and if it passes that vote check by the voter, then the permission is granted. Any attributes which start with role underscore, like role admin, get checked by the role voter, which is a special voter that checks the user's roles against the attributes which are being tested. So let's dump out the user's roles. And as you can see, we have an array with one role, which is role user. And now let's dump out the attributes. And as you can see, we have the same thing. We have an array of attributes with just the one, which is a role user. So this should be a match. Let's just have a little reminder of where this role user comes from for the user. So when we call get roles, we automatically add the role user to the array of roles which comes back. Voters have their own unique way of checking if a certain permission is granted, and the way that the role voter works is it loops through the attributes, loops through the roles, and just checks if they are a match, and if so, access is granted. So that one's fairly straightforward and easy to understand. We can create our own custom voters, and that's what we're going to need to do in order to check if a user is allowed to view a account. So as you can see, the isGranted method takes two arguments. The second one is optional, and that will be the subject. So the first one will be our attribute, and we're going to call this show. You can call it anything, but show is a good name because that's what we're checking what the user can do. And then the second argument will be the account. So we're going to see if the user is granted to show the account. Fairly straightforward so far, I hope. What I'm going to do in order to keep the conditionals to a minimum inside of my control method is move the check into an annotation just above the method. So it's pretty much exactly the same. I'm using the isGranted annotation, and the first argument will be the attribute and the second argument will be the subject. And just note that I'm using a string here which matches the account argument, like so. And then what we'll do is we'll go and try this out. Now at the moment we don't have a voter which handles a show attribute, and in such circumstances, as you can see here, access is denied because in such circumstances the default is that access would not be granted. In other words, the isGranted check evaluates to false. Let's create a voter, and we do this with Symfony console make : voter. So this will make it for us. Of course, you could just go and write the code yourself. We're going to call it account voter, and that's all we need to do. Let's go and check out our new account voter. So this first method supports, it takes the two arguments, attribute and subject, and basically this works like our login form authenticator supports method. It's checking to see if this voter is needed. And so it'll look and see if the attribute matches one of the values in this array, and also if the subject is an instance of app entity account. And so if this returns true, then yes, this filter is going to be needed, and then it moves on to the next method, which is vote on attribute. And this is where we write our custom code to see if permission is granted. So we have access to a few things. Obviously, we've got the attribute, we have the subject. We can get the user off of the token using token get user. The auto-generated code is suggesting that we use a switch block to perform our checks. I have other ideas, but we'll go with it for now. And so what I'm just going to do is, for the case of show, I'm just going to return false for now. And that should still show our access denied exception message. So let's go back over to the browser. In fact, we'll change this to account so that if it does get through, we show the account. Refresh. Okay, access is still denied. Now, let's change this to true, and we should see our account getting dumped out. And there you go. So we know that that's working. Now we could just apply our own logic and make it work the way we want it to. I'm using PHP 8, and I don't particularly like switch blocks. I think they're really ugly. So what I'm going to do is use a match expression. So if you've not used these yet and you are using PHP 8, it's your lucky day. This is going to be pretty cool. We're going to reduce all that mess to just a couple of lines of code. And the way it works is that we return the result of the match expression. We'll stick with just using booleans for now, and then we'll make it a bit more complex as we go along. So I'm just going to dump out the access is granted variable and see what we get. So we should match show, and in which case we'll get true. So refresh, true. Let's change this to false. Refresh, false. Okay, that's working. So now what we need to do is decide what our rules are for deciding on whether we can show the account to the user who is asking. The way I'm going to do this is check if the authenticated user is the account holder or if the authenticated user is the account manager. I'm just renaming the subject argument to account just to make this clear. And so let's perform our checks. So account. I think some auto-completion would serve as well here. So I'll add a dot block and I'll make this an account. And then account, get account holder. And then I'll check if that is the user, which we're getting off the token, or account, get account manager, and same again, I'm seeing if the account manager is the authenticated user or vice versa, and this should return us a boolean. Let's go over to the browser and have a look. And so we get true for that. I'm logged in as the account manager, so if I remove account manager from this check, I should get false, which I do. Everything's working well, and so all we have to do is return the result of this method. Now, you might sometimes be tempted to do something like this, where you just directly return the expression. I'm not really keen on those things, because if someone's reading this for the first time and they're not sure about match expressions, it might not be instantly obvious. Whereas if you're returning a variable saying access is granted, which is a result of an expression, then any other developer can read this and have a pretty good idea of what's going on straight away. So try and be explicit, keep your code fairly clear and easy for others to read. Okay, with that bit of life advice out of the way, let's go and render a page which we can show. I'm going to pass in the account, and then what we'll need to do is create a template. So over in templates and in accounts, we'll just call it show.html.twig. And we'll create something really simple initially, just to check that it's working, which will be a page that shows maybe the account number. In fact, yes, we'll do that. So just one heading and the account, and the way that we access the account is in the double curly braces, and then we can get the ID by doing .id. So in here we just put in the name of our template, and then we can run it in the browser, and as you can see, that's working, and we have access because at this moment in time we are the account manager. Let's add a couple of list items, and one will be the account holder name or username, and the other one will be the account manager's username. So curly braces, account.accountmanager.username, and that's how we access the account manager's username. And I think what I'll also have is a link where I can delete the account, and under the delete attribute in our voter, we'll add some special logic in there to do that, a special rule in order to be able to delete an account. So I'll give this a path name of delete account, and we're going to need to pass in the ID. The way we do that in Twig is like this. So ID : account.id, and that will give us the account ID that we're going to delete as a URL parameter. So like our show method where we're using the ID, we're binding the ID which will map to the account. We're doing exactly the same thing with delete here. So the method will take an account, and then the routing fairly similar to the show method, except we're going to call it accounts, and then we have the ID in the curly braces and then delete, and we need to give it the name. So the name that we used in our Twig file was delete account, and we're going to specify that the method is get. And so here we're going to have our is granted, and the attribute is of course delete, and then the subject is account, so exactly the same as we did for our show method there. And from this one, all I'm going to do is just return a response with a message that says that the account has been deleted. So a response comes from HTTP Foundation, and I'm just saying deleting account, and then we'll add the account ID. So if we now go back to our account voter, let's figure out what we're going to do here. What I really want to do, because deleting an account is probably quite a big thing, let's say that this can only be performed by admins only. How do you suppose we do this? We need to check if the user is an admin. So we can actually access the security component in other services just by injecting it into the constructor. I'm using PHP 8, so I'm going to use property promotion. So with one line of code, I now have injected the security component. Let's dump it out and just make sure that this is working first before we try and do anything with it. Refresh. Okay, so Symfony component security core security. That's what we're looking for. Let's now use this on our delete attribute. So of course we can call is granted on security, and then the attribute for that will be role admin, meaning that the role voter will get called behind the scenes. Let's go and test this out in the browser. So refresh, then we just need to click the delete. Access denied. Perfect. So just what we were expecting, the only person who can delete an account is an admin. So just before we sign in as an admin, I think it'll be a good idea to also allow an admin to show an account. Now, as you can see, this is becoming quite unwieldy. So what we'll do is we'll strip that out and we'll replace it with a show method, which we'll add underneath this. It's going to need to take the account and the user. So we'll pass those in as args, and we'll go away and create that now. So fairly straightforward. We'll just make this a private function. Don't need access to it outside of this voter. Show account user, and then we're returning what we were originally going to do from the match expression, but we're also going to add on a check to see if the user has the admin role. So exactly the same as what we're using on the delete attribute. This security is granted role admin. Okay, and that should be good for us. We'll just indicate that this should return a boolean. And I think we're ready to test it out. So let's go over to the browser. First off, we'll log out because we need to log back in as a admin. So log out, and then our admin is this one here, Gary@example.com. And we'll move over to look at our account, and we should get access because we are an admin. Okay, so far so good. Let's delete this. Perfect. Deleting accounting one. So 2 voltage checks passed there, one for show and one for delete. That's as far as I'll go with permissions and voltage. You can go deeper into this stuff, but save that for the documentation, I think. If you have enjoyed this and you have found it useful, then give it a like, and don't be afraid to share if you want to help other developers like yourself. That's what good developers do. In the next one, maybe I think we'll look at a bit of testing to finish off, which will probably only get about 12 views, but I like to be thorough. In the meantime, if you want YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon. I release new material every few days, and details of my schedule can be found on the community tab of my YouTube channel homepage.